and gonna just get right to our presentation. We have a great team. We have Bridget Gibbons, Claire Matten, Jenny Belmedia, and Anna Perez-Walter is part of the team but is not with us, and I'm sorry if I may mispronounce your name in any way. So here's a quick introduction to the team. Claire, Bridget, and Jenny are second-year master students at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. Students in the Bren School spend a little over a year working in teams with outside clients to produce a project that solves an environmental science or management issue. For their project, Claire, Bridget, and Jenny have developed a decision support tool on behalf of their client, the Environmental Defense Fund, that can inform the placement of multi-benefit groundwater recharge projects in California's Central Valley. So today we will hear an in-depth explanation of the development and application of this tool. So welcome to the team, and I think you should be able to move forward and put your presentation up to share.
Okay, let's see if I can start sharing. Can everyone see that? Okay, great. Hello, and welcome to our LunchMAR presentation, Water Resilient California, Strategically Siting Groundwater Recharge Projects to Benefit Communities and Ecosystems. My name is Jenny Belmedia, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Bridget Gibbons and Claire Matten. As Arit mentioned, Anna Perez-Walter also worked on this project, but is unable to join us today. As Arit also mentioned, we are master's students at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara, and the following work was completed as part of our master's thesis group project. As many of you may already be aware, there are existing tools to help GSA strategically site groundwater recharge projects, such as the Soil Agricultural Groundwater Banking Index, or SAGB, developed at the UC Davis Center for Watershed Science, and the Groundwater Recharge Assessment Tool, or GRAT, developed by Sustainable Conservation. We see our tool falling in between these two in terms of both ease of use and the level of detail in recommending locations. Our tool is an open access tool and provides location recommendations at the groundwater basin scale based on customizable scenarios, though to a lesser degree than the customization in GRAT. We see it as a good option for managers who want to consider more factors that are included in SAGB, but may not have the resources to utilize GRAT. It can also be used as a first exploration for a basin or GSA before using GRAT. And with this, we have our first poll question, which I don't know exactly how this works, but Arit will take care of it. And our poll question is, which of these existing tools are you familiar with? We've listed SAGB and GRAT, but are interested to know if there are others that we may not be familiar with that you've used. And hopefully we can hear about those other tools at the end of this presentation.
And just as a reminder that if you respond with an other, it would be great if you can put what you're referring to as other in the chat.
Mm-hmm. It looks like responses have slowed. So I don't know if the poll stays open, but I'm gonna continue on. It looks like there are a good number of you who have experience with SAGB and GRAT, and some people with others. So hopefully we get to find out what those others are. Okay. So many GSPs identify groundwater recharge as one strategy they will use to meet the requirements of SGMA, though they haven't yet identified the exact locations of these projects. Additionally, most do not consider additional benefits outside of addressing undesirable results. The problem, as we see it, is many groundwater managers lack the tools and information needed to identify the best locations for groundwater recharge projects that can also benefit communities and ecosystems. To address this, we developed a customizable and accessible decision support tool to locate sites for groundwater recharge projects in California's Central Valley that have the potential to produce benefits to communities and ecosystems while increasing local water resilience. We created our decision support tool using ArcMap Model Builder. We designed it to use all publicly available spatial data sets from government and academic institutions and be transferable to any groundwater basin in the Central Valley. We wanted anyone in the region to be able to use our tool, no matter how much locally specific data they had for their basin. We also designed it to be customizable based on local priorities and to consider the feasibility of construction at a preferred location. Here we have an overall schematic of our tool that shows what the components are and how they combine together. And we'll explain each of these components in greater detail later, but for now I just want to give you a general overview. We begin with surface and subsurface conditions, which considers how well water can infiltrate past the surface and percolate down into the aquifer. We also want to include water quality, which considers locations least likely to introduce new contamination into the groundwater. These two components are conservatively combined and further filtered to include only appropriate land use types to give us our suitable recharge locations. Suitable recharge locations answers the question of where you can most easily get clean water into the ground, and this can be an output on its own if that's all a water manager is interested in. But we also wanted our tool to include additional considerations related to siting recharge projects. And with this in mind, we consider a project's ability to provide the additional benefits of rehydrating domestic wells that have run dry and supporting groundwater-dependent ecosystems. We also include considerations of the feasibility of a project's construction by including proximity to conveyance infrastructure and distance away from listed contamination cleanup sites. A user can customize how much priority is given to each of these additional considerations, and this customized weighting is overlaid on our suitable recharge locations to give a multiple benefit recommendation output. And now that you have a general sense of how our tool works and its intended use, I'm going to hand it over to Bridget, who will explain our methods in greater detail.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to begin by explaining the surface and subsurface tool component. So we incorporated 4 data layers: SAGB, depth to groundwater, the percent of coarse soil material, and the presence, depth, and thickness of core and clay. SAGB ranks locations on their recharge suitability from excellent to very poor based on a variety of conditions at the surface and down to 6 feet below the ground surface. Our tool considers excellent areas to be most suitable for recharge. We also incorporated data for depth to groundwater. The tool prioritizes areas where the water table is deeper in order to ensure there is adequate storage space for the recharged water. We included the percent of coarse soil material data from the Central Valley hydrologic model. By including this information in the tool, we hoped to approximate relative vertical hydraulic conductivity and get a measure of how easily recharged water could infiltrate and percolate down to the water table. We included the percent coarseness values from 5 depth ranges below the ground surface down to 250 feet. The tool prioritizes areas with greater soil coarseness values to facilitate the recharged water reaching the groundwater table. We also included data related to core and clay. The tool prioritizes areas where the core and clay is not present to act as a confining layer inhibiting recharge, which are the white areas on this map. In figures where the clay is present, it's preferable to be deeper and thinner, which would limit the extent to which it might inhibit water movement in the subsurface. So those 4 input data layers are combined together in a weighted sum to produce the final surface and subsurface output. The values shown here are relative weighting, but when incorporated into our tool, the values are transformed so that they add up to 100%. We weighted SAGB most heavily in our tool, and that is because SAGB itself is an index value that contains 5 data layers that are important for recharge suitability. We also reason that surface and near surface conditions related to water infiltration are key to a successful recharge project, and our other data layers related to subsurface are less relevant if water is unable to first enter the ground. We weighted depth to groundwater as the next most important factor. We wanted to prioritize areas with enough storage space to receive the recharged water and avoid issues with root zone residence time. Percent of core soil material and core and clay are weighted less heavily. While important for understanding how the recharged water will move in the subsurface, even areas with potential confining layers may still provide opportunities for recharge. We want to acknowledge that these relative weightings are one of the areas with greatest uncertainty in the design of our tool. After an extensive literature review, these values are what we thought to be reasonable based on the goals of our tool. Due to time constraints, we were not able to conduct a formal sensitivity analysis, but we did conduct many iterations of different relative weighting schemes to see the resulting changes in the output in the process of arriving at these values. So those are the components that are incorporated into the surface and subsurface part of the tool, and I'll now explain how we included a consideration of water quality. The water quality parameter that we focused on and were able to incorporate into the tool relates to nitrogen. We built this component with the reasoning that land areas with higher nitrogen loading on the ground surface present a higher risk and would be more likely to introduce new sources of nitrogen into the groundwater. Using data from the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, we calculated a nitrogen balance for 3 years, 1990, 2005, and 2020. We considered additions to be atmospheric deposition, nitrogen fertilizer application, and applied nitrogen from manure or effluent. From those additions, we subtracted losses, atmospheric losses, nitrogen uptake by crops that are harvested, and nitrogen in runoff. We incorporated the nitrogen balances from 1990 and 2005 to represent historic land uses over time. The 2020 data is projected data, and we felt it was important to include to represent conditions at the beginning of the SGMA implementation period. The 3 years of nitrogen balances are combined in a weighted sum, with the 2020 balance being weighted most heavily. Those are the details of the surface and subsurface and water quality components. So now I'll talk through how those two are combined to produce our suitable recharge location output. So when combining surface and subsurface conditions with water quality, the worst score that an area had for either component is the one that is retained. In that way, for example, if a particular area scored very well for surface and subsurface conditions, but had high levels of nitrogen on the ground surface, the poor score for nitrogen is the one that is retained. We believed this approach to be more conservative in identifying the limiting factor for recharge in any given location. The suitable recharge location step of the tool also considers land use types that would be suitable for a recharge project. Using the National Land Cover Dataset, the tool retains information only for areas that are cropland, pasture, barren, shrub or scrub, or grassland. Notably, this step removes medium and high density development and forested land. Here you see an output for our tool when run over the entirety of the Central Valley, where green areas are relatively better for recharge and red are worse. It's important to note that the outputs are provided on a relative basis within the chosen extent. We did not set a firm standard for what makes any particular location able to be used for a recharge project or not. So the resulting output instead identifies areas within the tool extent as more or less suitable. You may be noticing, for example, that there are more red areas in the Sacramento Valley. Because the output is relative, this doesn't mean that these areas are unsuitable for recharge. It just means that areas in the San Joaquin Valley are relatively better based on the data inputs included in our tool. For example, our tool prioritizes areas where there is more available storage space for recharged water, meaning areas with higher water tables are less preferable. You may also remember from the maps of the data input layers that percent coarseness and SAGB scores were also less preferable in some areas of the Sacramento Valley. Again, these outputs are relative, and this map of the entire Central Valley is primarily to demonstrate our tool functionality. We envision our tool being more commonly used on the groundwater basin scale. So here you can see our tool results. Next slide, Jenny. When run for individual groundwater basins, the tool default is set to output the top 10% of scores within the groundwater basin. If 10% of the basin area does not provide enough options based on other considerations such as land use or ownership, the output can be adjusted to show more land area. In these maps, the dark green areas are better for recharge compared to the more yellow areas, but again, the results shown are the top 10% within the basin. These areas are where recharged water will be able to most easily reach the groundwater table while limiting the risk of introducing new nitrogen into the groundwater. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Claire, who will explain how our tool builds off of these results to include additional considerations of benefits and feasibility.
Thanks, Bridget.
So now that we have used our tool to identify the relative best areas within a subbasin to focus our groundwater recharge efforts, we're going to add on the additional considerations that allow for customization of these outputs. This is the interactive portion of the tool that allows users to create basin-specific recommendations that incorporate their local priorities. And we envision this process of selecting benefit and feasibility weightings would include a substantial amount of stakeholder engagement and be iterative to ensure that all needs and perspectives are incorporated. So with that, we have our next poll question, which is to ask who among you have been a part of a stakeholder engagement process related to GSP development? So I think that should be available soon. And you can just select yes or no. If you have a different answer to share besides yes or no, you can add it to the chat. We'd be interested to hear. And Jenny, I'll let you decide when we should move on. I can't see how many people have answered the poll, so.
Yeah, it looks like most people have answered, and the majority is no, 63% no, and 37% yes.
Okay, so still a good amount of you have been part of some sort of stakeholder engagement process. We feel this is really important to addressing how to benefit communities and ecosystems through recharge. So with that, we'll carry on. So Jenny introduced the additional considerations of our tool earlier, but I'm going to give you a bit more detail on the data that we used to incorporate these into our tool. So we used the Department of Water Resources Domestic Water Supply Shortage Reporting System to access the location of domestic wells that have run dry, and used a data set developed by the Nature Conservancy and DWR to identify the location of potential groundwater-dependent ecosystems. The location of existing water conveyance infrastructure was accessed through the National Hydrography Dataset, and we used the GeoTracker web portal generated by the State Water Resources Control Board to locate contamination cleanup sites that may pose an additional threat to water quality. For each of the additional considerations, we came up with 4 concentric zones of influence and then ranked those zones from better to worse. The weighted sum of the ranks of selected considerations are then overlaid on top of the previously identified most suitable recharge locations that Bridget introduced. So I'm going to walk through an example to better explain how this part works. To reach a multi-benefit recommendation, a user has a total of 100% to allocate between each of the 4 additional considerations that I have mentioned. The bars on the left are a visual representation of how a user can adjust the tool to customize their outputs. You can think of these like dimmer switches that change the relative importance of each additional consideration. The map on the right is the top 10% of suitable recharge locations for the Madera subbasin, which we selected for demonstration during this presentation. However, a reminder that similar outputs could be generated for any basin in the Central Valley. Using the Madera subbasin as an example, I will demonstrate a few hypothetical scenarios of how a user might select weightings of additional considerations and generate an updated recommendation map. First, you could imagine that you're an engineer and your concern is largely around the feasibility of constructing these groundwater recharge projects. You might select 80% of the weighting to go towards locations that are near to water conveyance infrastructure, and the remaining 20% towards locations that are far away from listed contamination cleanup sites. These selections have updated the map on the right to now display a ranking of the best places to achieve the selected benefits within the suitable recharge locations that we previously identified. Darker orange locations are the most preferred to achieve the selected benefits, but all locations in the orange to yellow scale fall within the top 10% of recharge suitability for the basin. On the other hand, maybe you're an ecologist and you're interested in how groundwater recharge can benefit species and habitats. In this case, you might adjust the switches to assign 70% of the weighting to groundwater-dependent ecosystems, 20% to locations that are close to water conveyance infrastructure, and the final 10% towards locations that are far from listed contamination cleanup sites. The map has now updated to show the newly assigned rankings, with the dark orange areas again identifying the best locations to achieve the desired benefits within the top 10% of previously identified suitable recharge locations.
Now, you may be wondering how the maps generated as outputs from our tool can inform the placement of groundwater recharge projects. In the case of the Madera Subbasin, the draft of the Madera Joint Groundwater Sustainability Plan indicated an intention to construct 350 acres of dedicated groundwater recharge projects, which represents about 0.1% of the land area in the subbasin. In the hypothetical scenarios that I just presented to you, the most preferred locations to achieve the selected benefits, which were the areas in the darkest orange color, cover between 0.06% and 2.5% of the subbasin's land area. So we feel this demonstrates how our tool can help to substantially narrow the land area under consideration for recharge projects and allow water managers to move quickly from site selection to project implementation. And I will now hand it back to Jenny, who will provide some concluding thoughts.
Great, thanks, Claire. So as you've seen, we intentionally designed this tool using the best publicly available Central Valley-wide data sources so that it could be used by any water agency in the region, no matter how much locally specific data is available. However, a limitation to this project is that some of the data sources used may be underrepresentative of actual conditions. For example, we believe that there is likely additional conveyance infrastructure that is not included in the National Hydrography data set. Also, the location of domestic wells that have run dry is a self-reported data set to the California Department of Water Resources, and so it also likely underrepresents the prevalence of these well locations throughout the Central Valley. With this in mind, we designed the tool so that if a manager has more accurate local data, the data source can be added to the tool to increase the robustness of the output results. There are requirements potential replacement data sets have to meet, and we've detailed what these are in our accompanying user manual. Another limitation of this project is that we did not have time to do a formal sensitivity analysis to test the weighting schemes and rankings that we chose, as Bridget mentioned previously. While we did do less formal checks for our results, we think a sensitivity analysis would strengthen this project and would be excited for future groups, from Bren or otherwise, to take this on. In addition to the sensitivity analysis, there are more potential benefits to groundwater recharge projects and more water quality concerns, which we weren't able to address in our tool. Listed here are the ones that came to mind for us. And in a few moments, we'll ask you which ones you would be interested in adding as well. For us, water quality concerns we weren't able to address include considerations of total dissolved solids and arsenic and other geogenic contaminants. Benefits we weren't able to address include flood risk mitigation and creation of waterfowl habitat. Our tool represents a good starting point for groundwater managers looking to identify locations that are better suited to achieve multiple benefits for groundwater recharge. And we are excited by the possibility of others expanding on this work in the future. And now our third poll question, which is, what would your next priority be for incorporating more into the tool? We have, I don't know if the poll is open now, and we have a lot of different choices. You can select more than one here. And we also have an other box. So if you choose other, again, we'd be interested in knowing what that is. Looks like we still have numbers coming in. Got about 50 of almost 90 people in this call. So far, it doesn't look like there's a clear winner, but flood risk mitigation seems high up. Crop types best suited to recharge, water supply reliability, and drought preparedness and climate change adaptation have all been ranked pretty high so far. So I'm going to continue on, but we can hopefully talk about that more in the discussion. So the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has created a huge opportunity to rethink the way that we manage water in California. Our tool provides water managers with the resources they need to move beyond baseline compliance and instead strategically plan for a better water future. And now, Bridget and Claire will give us a brief tour of a web application we created to visualize our tool results and of what the interface looks like in ArcMap.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to begin by walking through our web-based data visualization tool. We created this app in RStudio and are in the last stages of finalizing. So we hope to post the URL to our website in about a week for both the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. This app provides a qualitative exploration of some of our tool results. So a user can select a groundwater basin of interest on the left. For this example, it's set to the Chowchilla Basin. On the Basin Information tab, the location of that basin is shown in blue, along with additional information including area, population, and the basin priority as determined by DWR. The user can then navigate to the Recharge Suitability Viewer tab. Now shown is the suitable recharge location output from our tool, where areas shown in green are relatively better for recharge and red are worse. The checkboxes on the right side of the map include the benefit and feasibility considerations that we included in the tool, and the user of the app can overlay some or all of these layers on top of the suitable recharge locations. This allows for a qualitative look at how better areas for recharge may or may not align with the locations of the additional considerations. So on this slide, you can see examples of some of these overlays. In the map on the top left, you're seeing the locations of existing water conveyance infrastructure. In the map on the top right, the purple circles show the locations of listed contamination cleanup sites in the GeoTracker database. And in the map in the bottom row, the locations of domestic wells that have run dry are shown in the blue circles, and the locations of groundwater dependent ecosystems are shown in green. So this app can provide a first look at a tool output and the types of data that were included for additional benefits and feasibility. If interested, a user can then go ahead and download the full ArcMap tool along with all the input data, which Claire will now go over.
Great, thanks, Bridget. So for those of you who are familiar with or work regularly in ArcGIS, we thought it'd be interesting to provide a brief demonstration to show what the tool interface looks like in ArcMap and how a user can interact with the tool to customize their outputs. So we'll start here, which is an overview of the entire tool in Model Builder. For those of you who may not be familiar, Model Builder is an application in ArcMap that allows you to build workflows that string together sequences of geoprocessing tools, feeding the output of one tool into another tool as an input. And this is a screenshot of the full tool zoomed out to include every step of the processing. But of course, it's pretty impossible to see what's going on here. So we're going to zoom into a few key areas that we intend to be updated by the user based on the outputs of interest. First, we'll go to the section that allows for defining the weight of the additional considerations, which is outlined in the red box there. And to define the desired weights, a user needs to open the dialog box called Update Multi-Benefit Weightings of the workflow and update the information inside. You can see what that dialog box looks like when it's open. And you can see here, again, outlined in the red box, a place to input the weighting combination that you select, which has to add to 1. And when you've set the weights and clicked OK, you might also be interested in changing the % of the basin land area that you're considering in your outputs. As Bridget mentioned earlier, if the default of 10% isn't enough to give you the information you're looking for, you can update that. To do that, we'll move over to this section that is now outlined in a red box. And here you can update, you can open the dialog box to update the amount of land area that is retained in the suitable recharge locations output. You can choose any increment of 10% to retain. So all you have to do is add an entry to increase the number. So if you add an entry and put 2 in both the old values and the new values column, you would retain 20% of the land area, and 3 would mean 30%, etc. So making changes here will not only update the amount of land area that appears in the suitable recharge locations output, but will also propagate to the multi-benefit recommendation output. Lastly, we have included an option to rename the outputs of your model runs to be descriptive of the selections that you have made in the steps that I just went through. And we think this is particularly helpful if you want to compare between multiple different scenarios and outputs and want to keep track of which one is which. When the tool is available for download, the zipped folder will contain a user manual that explains in detail, including screenshots, how to go through each step of using the tool to produce your desired outputs. And so that concludes the brief tour of our tool. We're happy to answer more questions in just a second, but we would first like to thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Scott Giuseco, and our project advisors, Dr. Bob Wilkinson and Mira Gavecci from the Department of Water Resources for their support and guidance on this project. We would also like to thank our clients at EDF, Ann Hayden and Anna Schiller, along with many others who helped us along the way. And thank you all for listening. We would now be glad to move on to questions and a discussion about our work.
Thank you, Claire, Bridget, and Jenny. This was a terrific presentation. And Jenny, I know that you're monitoring the just chat window, and then if participants want to also use the hand raise function in the participants window to get into a queue. Your presentation generated comments and questions on the chat, and so we have some time for that.
Yep, I've got a couple questions from the Zoom chat if we want to start there. The first question is, it's multi-part. What is the spatial scale of the water quality component? Why nitrogen? And what about other water quality constituents?
Okay, I can start on that, and Bridget and Jenny maybe hop in. So the first answer is the spatial scale for all of the components in our tool is about 3 acres. We did that because that was the sort of lowest resolution data set that we could access, and so everything else had to be sort of matched to that scale to make our tool work. But we still feel like that's a high enough resolution to be useful, and well, we hope that. Okay, the second part of the question was why nitrogen? Through our literature review, we found that nitrate contamination in groundwater caused by recharge is a big issue, and often something that limits the success of projects. So that was sort of why we chose to focus on that as our water quality parameter. We also explored how to incorporate other contaminants, as Jenny mentioned, including arsenic, other geogenic contaminants, and those ended up being, I guess, a lot more dependent on location factors that we didn't have a way to incorporate in our tool. So we decided basically to focus on a smaller amount of parameters and do what we felt was like a really thorough job with those. And as we mentioned, we're hoping that this becomes something that other groups can add onto or use and expand upon. So I hope that answers your question. And Bridget and Jenny, if you have anything to add, please do.
You gave a great answer. Just to briefly add on that, we identified from the beginning nitrogen, arsenic, and total dissolved solids as the 3 water quality pieces that we would ideally include, since those are mentioned as objectives in most GSPs. But for what Claire said, we were only able to address the nitrogen.
Thank you, guys. Another question from the Zoom chat. Does the tool identify successful water banking areas?
I can start with that one. I mean, it identifies areas where you can most easily get clean water into the ground. And so, yeah, it could be used for that. We don't really specify what type of groundwater recharge projects would be best suited for each location. So whether it's LunchMAR or building recharge basins, we don't really specify that. And that's maybe something that could be added to the tool in the future as well.
Does it happen to identify existing water banks?
No, we don't have that included. Although that could be interesting and actually fairly easy to add, is proximity to existing water banks. Good idea.
I won't take credit for it from the Zoom chat.
Well, good idea, whoever was in the Zoom chat.
There's no other questions in the Zoom chat. I invite people to either, oh, it looks like one just popped in. One extension of the tool, excuse me, could be to add land values as a feasibility consideration. For example, if the tool were to choose the land under a town center for a recharge site, this would be infeasible. The logic extends to thinking about the most productive agricultural land. Do you think it would be feasible to include land values into the model/tool?
I can start addressing that one, and Claire and Jenny, feel free to hop in. So I think that is something that could be included. We just didn't have access to data that covered our desired sort of study extent of allowing this tool to run over the entirety of the Central Valley, which is why that wasn't incorporated. And instead we envisioned it more so as a starting point to produce the output that shows the relatively better areas for recharge that could achieve the desired benefits and feasibility consideration, and fully understand that from that step, there's then a lot of sort of additional research that needs to happen on the local level, depending on, as you mentioned, sort of land value and crop type and agricultural productivity. So we envision that doing that happening sort of after our initial tool output. And yeah, we didn't include it primarily just due to data limitations.
As a quick add-on to that too, I think the question asked if, like, what if a town center were chosen as a recommended location? We've designed the tools so that that wouldn't happen. We've taken out medium and high intensity development as a possibility for recommending for locations, since we didn't want that happening. And probably for, well, yeah, that's probably where that would get filtered out. So the tool really wouldn't recommend that sort of location.
Great, thanks. I have a clarification on the water bank question. The clarification is, does the tool indicate that successful banks are good areas for banking? So just in my own words here, if you put existing water banks on there, do they align with kind of the areas that your tool is saying are good areas for recharge?
That's a great question. I can start. So we didn't explore that, but now I want to. I think that would be yeah. And I think part of the reason we weren't necessarily comparing to locations that recharge is already happening is because there's a lot of variation in how those locations were selected. That so the locations that would be identified as the relative best in our tool might have considered a different set of parameters than what went into deciding where a particular water bank was located. Presumably there's some amount of overlap, but that wasn't necessarily a metric that we were measuring against for how functional our tool was. I hope that answers that follow-up.
Thank you. Next question. Did you try to distinguish between unconfined and confined aquifers? The DWR water levels are measured from different aquifers / types of aquifers.
I could start with this, and Bridget and Claire jump in. So we didn't address confined versus unconfined aquifers specifically calling them those, but by incorporating the presence or absence and thickness of the Corcoran clay and the percent coarseness. We tried to get at confining layers for aquifers and where there would be better vertical hydraulic conductivity.
Okay, great, thanks. There's another question. Why not simply take the output from this tool as an input to existing land use planning tools? I think there's a lot of folks on this call that would like to weigh in on that one, with just a hearty, here. But it was posed as a question. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on how to use the tool the outputs of your tool as an input to land use planning?
I'm not super familiar with existing land use planning tools, but if they can take some sort of, our output can be, and I don't know how technical we want to get, but it can be raster or vectors, spatial data. So if that's an input into an existing land use planning tool, then that sounds like a great idea.
Great. Another water quality question. The nitrate risk method seems to be based on current applied nitrogen, but could you also use the historic nitrogen data to predict legacy nitrogen loading in the beta zone, which could be a much greater risk than current fertilizer application?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. So we have included historic nitrogen loading data. So we generated a weighted sum of nitrogen balances from 1990, 2005, and 2020. And we did that because our literature review indicated that the majority of nitrogen in the Veda zone decays after about 30 years. So we felt that that was a good measure of historic nitrogen loading and could get us close to sort of nitrogen loading trends in the years between those data sets that we had access to. The reason that we didn't do every year between 1990 and 2020 is because the data availability just wasn't there. So we felt like that was our attempt to consider historic land use and nitrogen loading that may be present in the Veda zone.
Great, thanks. One last question I see, getting back to the idea of unconfined, combined versus unconfined aquifers. Seems to be more of a comment, but following on Julia's question, which was unconfined, confined aquifers, weighting the deepest groundwater levels the most heavily may not reflect the capacity of surface application of water to recharge those aquifers. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I guess I can start with that. Claire, were you about to? Okay. So we do weight SAGB the most heavily in our tool, and that considers the surface application of water to recharging the aquifers below. And then we include the depth to groundwater as another factor in that. So hopefully, and our feeling is that we've been able to address the surface factors by weighting SAGB most heavily.
And I'll just add on a little bit more like of a broad response that the inspiration behind building this tool was the recognition that many GSPs in the Central Valley are identifying that recharge is going to be part of their strategy to meeting the requirements of SGMA. And so we're not necessarily guaranteeing that the locations that are identified in our tool outputs will result in a specific amount of water reaching the groundwater table, but more that if you have a certain land area to work within, presumably a groundwater basin or a GSA's, area, many GSAs are probably going to want to know within the land area that I have to work with, what's the best place to focus these recharge efforts. So that was sort of more the motivation of our tool. It's really hard to get specific volumes of water that reach a certain depth. There's just so much heterogeneity in the subsurface. So we moved towards this more relative sort of analysis with the assumption that the recharge projects are going to be happening, and if people have more information about where to focus these efforts, then it could be of more benefit.
That's it for Zoom, Orit.
Yeah, thank you. And there was a question about sharing the recording, and I think that would be available after.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll provide the link. And so I just quickly want to ask before we close, you had that one slide where you gave the engineer, in terms of output, the engineer perspective and the ecologist perspective, who represent different interests and priorities potentially. And I couldn't tell from your slide if there were areas of overlap or if they were just very different. And if you can speak to that a little bit in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, sure. So these do represent two pretty different scenarios, and I think our ideal sort of use of these outputs is that multiple scenarios meeting different combinations of interests would be run, and then you can overlay multiple spatial layers to find out where those areas intersect. So that would be up to the user to say, I want to find within these 3 scenarios that I ran, where is the overlap between all 3? And so that would be a possible sort of next step. Our tool doesn't do that for you, but if you're a competent GIS user, you would be able to do that.
Great. Well, thank you. Just want to thank you for a great presentation and give us a lot to think about, a lot of different questions. There's one more question. Do you consider river channels as part of the conveyance systems in the model? We'll let that be kind of the closing question.
Okay, I'll go for it. We do. We consider perennial rivers as part of the conveyance system. We excluded ephemeral and intermittent, though.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Claire.
Sorry, one last thing. I think Jenny has the links to our project website. If you're interested in more information, maybe we could get those into the chat. I can put it in there if it's not easily accessible. But our website has the full report we wrote on our research and a brief which kind of summarizes everything, and we'll have the links to both the web applications for visualizing the data and the downloadable version of the ArcMap tool. Hopefully within the next week or so. We're working on ironing out the last few technical issues. So if you're interested in following up, please visit our website, and there's more information for you there.
Great, and Jenny just put a link on the chat for everyone. So thanks again, and we have a couple more minutes as right before we close that we wanted to just open it up if there are any announcements or any activities or events that you want to share with everyone on the call as kind of next steps. And Jenny, I don't know if you have any specific activities that you want to highlight.
I do, but I'll do it last if that's okay, because then I can do my goodbye at the same time.
Okay, sounds good. So if there's anyone who wants to make an announcement or plug for an activity or an event that is happening related to this work.
Yeah, folks, feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and jump in if you have any reports you're working on, looking for partnerships, funding opportunities, anything you'd like to share. And I'll check the participants for hand raises.
Yeah, I don't see anything.
No, I don't either.
Okay, all right.
Everyone seems to still be on mute.
Yeah, so Jenny, before you do your closing, if it's okay for us to do the closing poll, we want to just ask everyone how relevant the presentation was to the work that you are doing, and just check in with everyone on best way to continue engagement. So I'll put the poll up while you give in your closing statement.
Yeah, thanks Claire, Bridget, Jenny for the great presentation. You've sparked a lot of great ideas in the chat for building onto the tool and how to use it in GSP planning. So Thanks again and great work, and congratulations on your master's thesis. A couple thoughts I had in the last few minutes before we wrap up. I thought I'd share some recent articles, blogs, reports that I've seen lately, and I'll share some links in the chat. First, right now there's an online environmental engagement conference that's being put on by Cal EPA and California Natural Resources Agency. It started yesterday, a few more hours this afternoon, and then all day tomorrow. Anyone who'd like to learn about using digital engagement tools, adapting engagement during the COVID-19 crisis, and what it all means for equity and environmental justice. Really timely, wonderful speakers over the last couple of days. So I encourage, if you have time to participate, it's time well spent. A couple MAR related announcements. California Water Blog posted on May 10th on how reliable our groundwater sustainability plans. I'll share a link to that. The Nature Conservancy in March opened up their pilot groundwater market exchange in Fox Canyon. I will share a link to some information that they've provided on that pilot groundwater market. And also a recent report from the Institute of Water Resources under the Corps of Engineers on managed aquifer recharge and resilience, which is a good read on how the Corps of Engineers has had experience in managed aquifer recharge projects throughout the country, but a lot of good examples in California. I hope to get the author of that report on a future LunchMAR. So if anyone has access to any of the authors, please drop a hint that they'll be receiving an invitation from me. We would really like to have them involved. And for our next topic, I'm sorry I ran a little long, is can managed aquifer recharge mitigate groundwater overdraft in the Central Valley? A research team from UCLA and UC Santa Barbara. So stay tuned for meeting information on that topic. And thanks everybody for participating in today's LunchMAR.
Thank you. Thank you, team.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Just
Great, thanks, Jenny.
okay.
Thank you. That was great. That was really great.
Yeah, and people are probably
Congratulations.
logging off, so I'll share the links I just talked about in the meeting notes. Thanks, everybody. Great job. All right.
Hi, thank you, Jenny, Arit, and Sophie.
Yeah, thanks so